In this video, we're going to take a look at Threshold 1 of Big History, the story of the Big Bang, and we're going to go from the Big Bang up until right before the first stars, which is the second threshold in Big History. Let's jump right into it. The Big Bang went down 13.8 billion years ago, but for the first moment, there's actually a little bit of uncertainty. The reason for that is that at some point in the past, the universe began expanding. But that moment when it began expanding, that moment when the Big Bang banged, was when inflation took off. But before that, there's not much intelligent that we can say. It's somewhat ambiguous. It first began expanding when an inflaton field appeared. This inflaton field, by virtue of being a dense vacuum energy, it began to expand, it began to fall outwards, it began to increase the amount of space more and more and more, before decaying into the ordinary matter and energy that we're more familiar with. But before that inflaton field appeared and took off, there's not much we can say about the universe, but there are two things that should be noted. One, the laws of physics were already baked into reality by the time the inflaton field appeared. And second, gravity was its own distinct force by the time the inflaton field appeared, while the other three forces, the electromagnetic force, the strong force, and the weak nuclear force, were all unified. They were all acting as if they were one. They were all acting in exactly the same manner. And the moment that the strong force separates from the weak force, inflation takes off. As inflation takes off, the universe begins expanding rapidly, and the dense vacuum energy increases and increases as space becomes larger. Eventually, this inflaton field, because it's unstable, it decays, and that fills the other fields of the universe with energy and leaves behind an incredibly hot universe filled with plasma, primarily dominated by quarks and gluons, quarks being the main component of protons and neutrons, gluons being the carrier particle for the strong force, the force that holds nucleon to nucleon within protons and neutrons, and also holds the quarks to quarks within mesons, protons, and neutrons. The quark-gluon plasma was swimming with radiation, and fermions and leptons, and some of the bosons. This era, which saw the electromagnetic and weak force still unified, comes to an end a trillionth of a second into history, as the expansion had decreased the density and therefore the temperature to the point that the electroweak force splits and the electromagnetic and weak force are on their own. Left behind is the world of photons, mostly gamma rays, and also the W+, W-, and Z bosons of the weak nuclear force, which interacted thenceforth in particle decay. The expansion continued until the density thins out such that the strong force, these gluons, yank back on the quarks that are getting increasingly far apart from each other, and at 100,000th of the first second in, the strong force snaps the quarks back into mesons and protons and neutrons, and for a flicker of time, the energy was still so high that the radiation was still able to create enough quarks to create protons and neutrons. However, at a 10,000th of a second, the radiation's too low for this, and the protons and the antiprotons go through a final annihilation into radiation, leaving behind one proton and one neutron for every billion protons and billion neutrons that existed at the time, and 0 antiprotons and 0 antineutrons. There was a slight disparity between matter and antimatter, which remains a mystery to this day. At the time protons and neutrons were initially created, the universe was so dense that neutrinos, a very tiny particle, were still stuck behind the other particles and couldn't stream freely. Because of that, these neutrinos, which can convert protons into neutrons and neutrons into protons, continue doing that, keeping the proton-neutron amount in perfect equilibrium. However, shortly before 1 second, with the neutrinos still tangled up with all these other particles, unable to escape, the kinetic energy of these neutrinos continued to go down until the point that these neutrinos didn't have enough strength, enough energy to convert a proton into a neutron, because a neutron actually weighs more than a proton. So in that brief interval, right when it becomes too low energy to convert protons into neutrons, the neutrinos continue to convert the neutrons into protons, and very quickly, by 1 second, that leaves a 6-to-1 ratio, 6 protons to every 1 neutron, and thankfully at that moment, the fog clears, if you will. The universe becomes thin enough that the neutrinos can now stream freely across the cosmos, and for most of them never hitting anything ever again. But what that means for these protons and neutrons is that no longer are the neutrons being immediately converted into protons. Instead, these neutrons will now go through their normal decay, which lasts 10 minutes and 11 seconds. So eventually they would all be gone either way, theoretically. But because the neutrinos decoupled, we have this 6-to-1 ratio, and that's going to become very important 59 seconds from now. Let's get back. So at the 1 second universe, these neutrinos are decoupled. The universe continues to expand and thin out up until about 10 seconds. And at about 10 seconds, the energy of the radiation of the universe is no longer sufficient to spontaneously create electrons and their antiparticle pair positrons. So that comes to an end. All the electrons and positrons crash, they annihilate into radiation, and you're left behind with 1 in a billion electrons and 0 positrons. A billion positrons and electrons collided, leaving behind the billion and first, billion and 1, that 1 of the electrons remained, and the rest of the billion were gone, and all the billion of the positrons were gone. And that takes us out of the lepton epoch, this time period where the universe is dominated by these lightweight particles, and instead brings us into the radiation epoch, this time period when photons are the dominant form of matter in the universe. That starts at 10 seconds, and then let's jump forward about 50 seconds as the universe continues to expand, and the neutrons continue to decay, and by about a minute in, the neutron ratio is now 7 protons for every neutron. At this point, we're reaching the point where nuclear fusion can sustainably happen. For the next 19 minutes, the entire universe was the temperature at the center of stars where nuclear fusion can occur. Almost all the neutrons were fused into protons with helium nuclei of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Some neutrons found themselves in other isotopes such as heavy hydrogen or deuterium or tritium and light helium, helium-3. And the unclaimed protons, the protons that didn't find themselves in these composite particles with other protons and neutrons, they remained as they were, lone protons or hydrogen nuclei. Now that the neutrons are in these various nuclei, they're now in a stable arrangement and they're no longer going to decay. So that freezes that 7-to-1 proton to neutron ratio at the 1 minute universe is frozen into place as cosmic nucleosynthesis goes down from 1 minute to 20 minutes into the universe's history. If you think about that ratio, 7-to-1, 7 protons for every 1 neutron, well, 1 neutron isn't enough for a helium nucleus. How many do you need? You need 2 neutrons. So let's change those numbers to 14-to-2, 14 protons for every 2 neutrons. And let's take 2 protons and 2 neutrons to make a helium atom. That takes out 4, and that leaves 12 lone hydrogen nuclei. That's a 12-to-4 ratio, that's a 3-to-1 ratio, that's a 75% to 25% ratio, which is the distribution of the elements in the universe, discounting the 1-to-2% of heavy elements that have been created ever since. As the universe continues to expand during this period, the radiation continues to lengthen and lower in energy. It reaches visible wavelengths of blue light about 50,000 years in, and it just climbs up to red across time as it moves to longer and longer wavelengths. But by 57,000 years, because of the expansion of the universe is depleting the energy of the radiation, what happens is, at 57,000 years, the amount of energy represented by the mass in the universe and the amount of energy represented by the radiation in the universe is even, and from right after 57,000 years, there's more matter than there is radiation. And when radiation loses its dominance, suddenly, dark matter is able to collapse gravitationally. In a radiation-dominated universe, normal gravitational collapse doesn't happen, where a denser region attracts things from a less dense region. But once radiation lost its dominance, dark matter could then begin to have that effect of gravitationally clumping up from one region to another, and we start having these large, massive dark matter halos that begin to grow. However, ordinary matter doesn't do this yet because the radiation is still too high pressure, it's still exerting too high of a pressure on it for it to fall. So it's feeling the gravitational attraction, it's falling towards the dark matter and then bouncing back thanks to the radiation, back and forth, back and forth. So it's maintaining roughly the same roughness. So roughly the same roughness is being maintained for the ordinary matter, but the dark matter is increasing in roughness dramatically from this 57,000 year mark on. This goes on until 380,000 years, and at that point, the radiation pressure is released and the matter begins to collapse as well. The reason why the radiation is released is because at that point we reach a temperature roughly 3000 Kelvin that electrons can no longer be knocked off of atoms. Therefore, all of the nuclei in the universe start attracting electrons in a stable way. The electrons bind themselves to these nuclei, making a universe that's filled with neutral atoms. And that means that the radiation can now travel unimpeded because it's not running into charged particles such as protons and electrons all the time. And it is now released in what we know as the cosmic microwave background. But the important thing from the perspective of the growth of structure is that the release of this radiation allowed the matter to fall towards these dense dark matter halos in a sustained way for the first time. At the 380,000 year mark, the universe is a dull orange, and with time it goes from orange to red to crimson, and by about 5 million years, the universe goes dark. And in the darkness, the dark matter halos continue to grow, the matter continues to fall into the center of these dark matter halos, these densest areas of the universe, and in the densest of these dark matter halos, the densest clouds of hydrogen and helium formed and grew more compact until, well, that's the next threshold, so it'll have to wait. If you enjoyed this video, like it. If big history is your thing, subscribe. And if you find value in my work, consider supporting my efforts on LiberaPay, link in the description below. Thank you.